Texas sells itself on wide-open highways, Friday night football, and small-town charm. What the tourism ads leave out is that several towns along those same highways post violent crime numbers among the worst in the country, according to recent FBI data. One town on this list holds the highest violent crime rate of any city in Texas right now. Another is where a masked killer terrorized couples on lovers' lanes in 1946 and was never caught, a case the state still calls one of its most notorious unsolved murders. A third town is built around two federal prison complexes holding more inmates than the town has residents, and our final entry carries a nickname straight out of old Hollywood, tied to a crime syndicate that once ran casinos, nightclubs, and local government almost in the open. If you like learning the real history behind places most travelers only see from the interstate, hit subscribe now, because we are working through 12 towns most guidebooks skip. Number 12, Snyder. Snyder sits in West Texas, a ranching and oil town in Scurry County, with just over 11,000 residents. Downtown still centers on a courthouse square, and a life-size statue honors the local legend of a rare white buffalo shot by hunters in the 1870s. That folksy image sits oddly next to recent FBI-based data, which puts Snyder's violent crime rate above 800 per 100,000 residents, more than double the national average. Because Snyder is small, a single violent incident can swing that number sharply, a pattern that repeats across this list. Oil boom and bust cycles have shaped the town for a century, bringing waves of transient workers and the instability that researchers consistently link to higher crime. Locals say the danger spikes with drilling activity rather than staying constant, but the numbers are high enough to earn this quiet oil town a spot here. Before number 11, if this deep dive into the towns Texas would rather you not think about is your kind of content, like this video now so more people see it. And if you have not subscribed, this channel covers the strangest, most overlooked corners of the country regularly, so consider joining us. Number 11. Webster sits between Houston and Galveston, and if you have stayed at a hotel near NASA's Johnson Space Center, there is a good chance you were actually in Webster. The city sits a few miles from Space Center Houston and Mission Control, and it hosts Baybrook Mall, one of the region's busiest shopping centers. That proximity to America's space program gives Webster a shiny image, the kind of place families pass through on the way to watch astronaut exhibits. The crime numbers tell a different story. Recent FBI-based data puts Webster's property crime rate above 5,900 per 100,000 residents, one of the highest in the entire state, driven largely by theft, tied to the hotels and retail corridors serving NASA area visitors. Its violent crime rate also runs well above the national average. Somewhere between the gift shop and the mall parking lot, Webster quietly became one of the more property crime-heavy small cities in Texas, and almost nobody visiting the Space Center ever hears about it. Number 10. Big Spring. Big Spring rose out of the West Texas oil boom of the 1920s. Flush enough with money to build the Hotel Settles, a 15-story tower once among the tallest buildings between Fort Worth and El Paso. During World War II, the town hosted a major Army airfield that later became Webb Air Force Base, closing for good in 1977. What happened to that old base afterward is the real story. Its buildings became two separate federal prison operations, the Federal Correctional Institution Big Spring and the privately run Big Spring Correctional Center, which together have held several thousand inmates in a city of roughly 21,000 people. It is unusual for a mid-sized Texas town to have this much of its identity tied to incarceration. Recent data shows Big Spring's violent crime rate above 760 per 100,000 residents, more than double the national average, with locals pointing to the prisons and the boom-and-bust oil economy as the reasons a town this size keeps showing up on statewide danger rankings. Number 9. Paris, Texas leans hard into its French namesake, building its own 65-foot Eiffel Tower replica outside the Civic Center in the early 1990s, then topping it a few years later with a giant red cowboy hat. Partly in good humor, and partly to one-up a taller replica Las Vegas was rumored to be planning. The tower became a real tourist draw, and the town's name even inspired the title of the 1984 film Paris, Texas. Underneath that charming branding, Paris carries a violent crime rate over 620 per 100,000 residents, according to recent FBI-based figures, well above the national average for a city its size. Like several towns on this list, Paris struggles with persistent poverty following decades of decline among the industrial and agricultural employers that once built it. Tourists posing under that cowboy hat-top tower rarely wander far from the civic center, and that is probably for the best. Number 8. Raymondville. Raymondville sits in Willacy County in the Rio Grande Valley, and for years its economy depended on a private detention complex known locally as Tent City, or by the darker nickname Ritmo, blending Raymondville and Guantanamo. The Willacy County Correctional Center held around 3,000 federal inmates inside Kevlar-covered dome tents and employed hundreds of locals in a county of roughly 21,000 people. On February 20, 2015, inmates seized control over conditions they said included inadequate medical care and overflowing toilets. The uprising lasted nearly 2 days before federal authorities regained control, and fires set during the unrest left the facility uninhabitable. The government canceled its contract soon after, the prison shut down, and Raymondville lost roughly 400 jobs almost overnight, a blow serious enough that locals started calling their own town Prisonville. The water tower still carries a faded smiley face, and the motto, "The City with a Smile," a strange contrast against FBI data showing a violent crime rate above 880 per 100,000 residents, among the highest of any ranked city in Texas. Number 7. Port Arthur. Port Arthur sits on the Gulf Coast beside Motiva Enterprises, the largest oil refinery in the United States, its lights visible for miles after dark. You would expect a city built around one of the country's biggest energy operations to thrive, but multiple rankings have identified Port Arthur as one of the poorest cities in Texas, with roughly a quarter to nearly a third of residents living below the poverty line depending on the year measured. Researchers have also flagged elevated asthma and cancer rates among children living closest to the refinery, a burden falling on the same neighborhoods already struggling economically. Crime data has shown Port Arthur running well above the national average for much of the past decade, and one national ranking went as far as calling it Texas's most miserable city to live in. There is a genuine silver lining. More recent reporting shows Port Arthur's crime numbers trending downward the last couple of years, suggesting the city may finally be turning a corner, even as the gap between the refinery's profits and its neighbors' living conditions remains hard to ignore. Number 6. Alice. Alice sits in South Texas ranch country, and for much of the 20th century it served as headquarters for one of the most infamous corruption machines in American history. George Parr, known as the Duke of Duval, inherited a political operation from his father and used it to control elections, law enforcement, and public money across Duval and Jim Wells counties for decades. The most famous episode came in 1948, when Parr's operation was tied to 200 nearly identical alphabetically added votes that appeared in Alice days after a Senate primary had closed, delivering an 87-vote win to a young congressman named Lyndon Johnson. Opposition came at a real cost. Reformers who organized against Parr in the early 1950s faced intimidation, and in one documented case, murder, when the son of an anti-Parr attorney was killed in an attack investigators linked to Parr's associates. Federal and state investigators eventually built more than 650 indictments against Parr's network, though Parr avoided prison for years through legal maneuvering before taking his own life in 1975 while appealing a tax evasion conviction. That legacy of corruption and violence outlasted Parr by decades, and Alice has continued posting crime figures above the state average, a small town still living in the shadow of the machine that once ran it. Number 5. Beaumont. Beaumont's place in American history was cemented in January 1901, when the Lucas Gusher blew in at nearby Spindletop and launched the modern American oil industry almost overnight. More than a century later, Beaumont remains a major refining hub, its skyline still dominated by the same kind of industrial infrastructure. That base has not translated into safety for residents. Recent FBI-based data ranks Beaumont's violent crime rate as the third highest of any city in Texas, above 1,100 per 100,000 residents, roughly triple the national average, with property crime running high as well in a city of just over 111,000 people. Beaumont's economy still leans heavily on refining and petrochemical work, industries that pay well for those employed directly but have historically left large parts of the surrounding community in persistent poverty, a gap researchers consistently connect to elevated crime. For a city that helped build the American oil age, Beaumont has struggled for generations to turn that legacy into lasting prosperity for the people who actually live there. Number 4. Galveston. Galveston is known today as a beach resort, but for roughly 30 years in the middle of the 20th century, it was better known as the Free State of Galveston, a nickname earned by openly ignoring Texas laws against gambling, liquor, and prostitution. Brothers Sam and Rosario Maceo ran that underground economy almost like a legitimate business, operating dozens of casinos and clubhouses across the island by the 1940s. Their crown jewel was the Balinese Room, a nightclub built on a pier stretching 600 feet into the Gulf of Mexico, famous for booking acts including Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope, while illegal gambling ran in the back rooms. The Maceos kept a strict, almost paternal code of conduct, reportedly covering rent for wives whose husbands gambled away household money, and the arrangement ran with remarkably little violence for decades. State authorities finally cracked down hard in the 1950s, ending the open era for good. Galveston today is a legitimate tourist destination, but recent crime data still shows a violent crime rate well above the national average, a reminder that the island never fully shed its reputation as a place operating just outside the reach of ordinary rules. Number 3. Texarkana. Texarkana sits directly on the Texas-Arkansas state line, split down the middle, and in the spring of 1946, it became the site of one of the most chilling unsolved crime sprees in American history. Over a 10-week period between February and May, a masked assailant attacked 8 people, killing 5, always at night and often targeting young couples parked in secluded spots outside town. The press dubbed him the Phantom Killer, and despite a massive joint manhunt across 2 states, he was never caught or definitively identified. Investigators focused heavily on a career criminal named Ewell Swinney, but he was never charged with the murders, and the case remains officially open, with Texas authorities describing it as one of the most significant unsolved murder cases in state history. The town's relationship with its own dark history is unusual. Rather than burying the story, Texarkana embraced it, casting local residents as extras when the 1976 film The Town That Dreaded Sundown was shot there, and it still screens locally around Halloween, near where one of the original attacks took place. Nearly 80 years later, whoever killed 5 people that spring has never faced justice. Number 2. Humble. Humble sits just north of Houston, close enough to George Bush Intercontinental Airport that most travelers never realize it is a distinct city, with its own government and its own serious crime problem. With roughly 16,000 residents, Humble might look like another suburb, absorbed into greater Houston's sprawl, but recent FBI-based data tells a different story. Its property crime rate sits above 10,000 per 100,000 residents, by far the highest figure recorded anywhere in Texas, driven by its dense concentration of hotels, retail centers, and rental car facilities serving the airport crowd. Its violent crime rate is elevated too, running at nearly 3 times the national average. Analysts point to exactly this kind of airport-adjacent commercial zone as a magnet for theft, since a constant churn of travelers and short-term stays creates far more opportunity for criminals than a typical neighborhood does. Millions fly in and out of that airport every year, and plenty spend a night in Humble without ever knowing they just stayed in one of the most property crime-heavy small cities in the state. Number 1. Donna. Donna sits in the Rio Grande Valley, a short drive from McAllen, in a stretch of South Texas that has struggled for generations with poverty and the pressures of sitting directly on a major drug and human trafficking corridor. According to the most recent FBI-based crime data available, Donna now holds the highest violent crime rate of any ranked city in Texas, at nearly 1,800 per 100,000 residents, close to 5 times the national average, with a property crime rate above 4,000 per 100,000 residents as well. For a city of under 17,000 people, those numbers are staggering, placing Donna ahead of far larger, more infamous Texas cities that usually dominate these rankings. The border region's economic challenges run deep, with limited industry beyond agriculture and cross-border trade, and law enforcement across the Rio Grande Valley has long pointed to trafficking routes running through towns exactly like this one as a major driver of violent crime. Donna does not have the name recognition of Houston or Dallas, yet according to the numbers, it currently sits at the very top of the list, the most dangerous city in Texas. 12 towns, and in every single one, the postcard version of Texas and the version backed up by FBI data turn out to be 2 very different places. If this rundown was worth your time, tap that like button before you go. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the corners of America most people drive straight past, and share this with anyone who thinks they already know everything about the Lone Star State. We will see you in the next one.